From riches to rags, or more accurately, from slightly less riches to rags. The Hayes family motto should have been impending doom, but we were too busy pretending to be important to notice. Dust motes danced in the weak sunlight filtering through the grimy windows of what was once our grand living room. Now it was just grandish. The threadbare throws covering the worn furniture did little to hide the fact that we were one misplaced decimal point away from living on the streets. Charlotte, darling, you must consider it. Vivian Hayes, my stepmother, delivered the line with the dramatic flair of a soap opera villainess, which, to be fair, wasn't far off the mark. Charlotte, my twin sister in appearance only, pouted. Marry him, but mother, he's blind. She spat the word out like it was a particularly distasteful piece of overcooked broccoli. He's also the CEO of Reed Enterprises, Vivian countered, her voice sharp as a freshly honed knife. And his father is willing to merge our assets. It's the only way, Charlotte. Merge our assets was a polite way of saying bail us out before we're forced to sell our kidneys on the black market. Father, bless his oblivious heart, was currently residing in a hospital bed, blissfully unaware that his minor ailment was costing us a small fortune, a fortune we no longer possessed. But he's a cripple, Charlotte whined, seemingly unfazed by our impending financial apocalypse. I can't be seen with a. She waved her hand dismissively, unable to even articulate the horror of being married to someone less than physically perfect. Vivian's perfectly manicured hand clenched. I could practically see the gears turning in her head, calculating, scheming. Charlotte, your father's health is precarious. The bills are mounting. We're on the verge of losing everything. Her voice softened, a subtle shift designed to manipulate. Your father, he wouldn't want this. He needs you, Evelyn. He needs us to be strong. The us was a blatant lie. Vivian cared about two things, money and her own perfectly preserved image. Father's well-being was merely a convenient tool. And I, apparently, was the designated sacrificial lamb. Charlotte continued to protest, her arguments becoming increasingly shrill and self-centered. I tuned her out, my mind racing. Run. That was the only sensible option. Pack a bag, grab what little cash I could find, and disappear. But the image of father, frail and vulnerable in that hospital bed, kept me rooted to the spot. Vivian turned her gaze on me, her eyes filled with a chilling mixture of desperation and calculation. Evelyn? You understand, don't you? It wasn't a question, it was a command, wrapped in a thin veneer of familial concern. It's just for the engagement, Vivian continued, her voice now a silken whisper. Just to secure the deal. Once the papers are signed, you can find a way out. Right. Because billionaires with controlling fathers were known for their lenient attitudes towards broken engagements. My escape plan was dissolving faster than a cheap tissue in a rainstorm. So, my life was forfeit, I thought bitterly, traded like a prize heifer to secure a merger. Fantastic. I'll do it, I said, the words tasting like ash in my mouth. For father. Charlotte, bless her shallow little heart, looked relieved. Vivian, on the other hand, looked like she just won the lottery. And in a way, she had. The ballroom of the Grand Regent Hotel was an exercise in opulent sterility. Towering floral arrangements that probably cost more than my entire wardrobe threatened to suffocate the guests with their cloying perfume. Crystal chandeliers dripped from the ceiling like frozen waterfalls, casting an icy light on the assembled crowd. The air practically vibrated with the cloying scent of desperation and expensive perfume. A perfect combination. I, of course, was wearing one of Charlotte's cast-offs, a shimmering, ridiculously expensive gown that felt like I was wearing a second skin made of liquid diamonds. It was designed to attract attention, and it was succeeding admirably. I felt like a prize-winning poodle on display. Chin up, darling, Vivian hissed in my ear, her smile fixed and predatory. Remember, you're Charlotte now. Right, Charlotte. The spoiled, self-absorbed twin who wouldn't know a genuine emotion if it slapped her in her perfectly contoured face. I, on the other hand, was Evelyn, the practical, cynical twin who is currently experiencing a level of existential dread usually reserved for characters in a Kafka novel. And then he arrived. Lucas Reed, the blind CEO, the monster I was supposed to marry. He was tall, much taller than I'd expected, with a build that suggested he spent his time doing something more strenuous than signing checks. His dark hair was impeccably styled, and his suit was clearly bespoke. But it was his face that captured my attention. It was a hard face, all sharp angles and planes, with a mouth that looked like it rarely smiled. His eyes, though unseeing, were a striking shade of ice blue. He moved with a controlled grace that was almost predatory. Even blind, he radiated power. Or maybe it was just the money. Beside him walked a man who was his polar opposite, shorter, slighter, with a calm, almost serene expression. This, I assumed, was Ethan Blackwell, his assistant. The buffer between the blind billionaire and the messy, inconvenient world. A borrowed earring, another one of Charlotte's extravagant baubles, chose that precise moment to stage a daring escape from my earlobe. It bounced off the polished floor and rolled, coming to rest near Lucas Reed's impeccably polished shoes. I bent to retrieve it, and that's when it happened. I bumped into him. Not a gentle nudge, but a full-body collision that nearly sent me sprawling. Strong hands gripped my arm, steadying me. "Careful there," a deep voice rumbled. I looked up, directly into those unseeing blue eyes. He was blind. Completely, utterly blind. And yet he held himself like a king surveying his slightly blurry kingdom. I'm so sorry," I stammered, my cheeks burning with embarrassment. He released me, his expression unchanged. "Ethan, the lady has dropped something." Ethan Blackwell retrieved the earring with a quiet efficiency, handing it to me with a small, polite bow. "Miss Hayes." "Thank you," I mumbled, feeling like an idiot. Pity? Curiosity? It was hard to tell. Whatever it was, I quickly suppressed it. This wasn't a fairy tale. This was a business transaction, and I was the collateral damage. The ballroom stage felt like a sacrificial altar. The hushed whispers of the guests were a morbid Greek chorus, commenting on the blind groom and the financially ruined bride. "Did you hear about the Hayes family?" "Lost everything, poor dears. And he's, well, you know." Damian Reed, Lucas's stepbrother, stood to the side, a smirk playing on his lips. He was everything Lucas wasn't. Flashy, ostentatious, and radiating an aura of smug self-satisfaction. He was also, I suspected, the source of many of those whispers. The ceremony began. The officiant droned on about love and commitment, words that felt utterly hollow in this gilded cage. My hands were clammy, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs. Then came the moment of truth. The ring. Lucas reached for my hand, his fingers brushing against mine. His touch was surprisingly gentle, but there was a hesitancy, an uncertainty that betrayed his blindness. He fumbled with the ring, his brow furrowed in concentration. A gasp rippled through the crowd. Someone, and I had a very strong suspicion it was Damien, shouted, "He can't even see her hand. He's blind." The whispers turned to murmurs, then to outright laughter. My cheeks burned with shame, not for myself, but for Lucas. Even I, in my cynical self-preservation mode, felt a flicker of something. It wasn't quite sympathy, but it was close. Lucas froze, his hand hovering awkwardly in the air. The silence was deafening, broken only by the occasional snicker. Instinct took over. I guided his hand to mine, my fingers wrapping around his. The ring, a ridiculously large diamond that probably cost more than my father's hospital bill, slid onto my finger with a smooth, almost defiant click. "Honestly," I said, my voice amplified by the microphone, "you'd think they'd never seen a man struggle with a ridiculously tiny piece of jewelry before. Or maybe they were just shocked that someone with my exquisite taste would deign to marry anyone." The "my" was dripping with sarcasm, a subtle jab at Charlotte and the entire ridiculous charade. A wave of nervous laughter rippled through the crowd. I'd managed to deflect the humiliation, at least for the moment. But the damage was done. After the ceremony, Lucas was not in a forgiving mood. He cornered me in a small, thankfully empty anteroom. "You think you're clever, don't you, Charlotte?" His voice was low and dangerous, the earlier hesitancy gone. "I think I'm surviving," I retorted, my own anger flaring, "which is more than I can say for your performance out there." He took a step closer, his presence overwhelming. You're bound to me now, by contract, by law. He pulled out a folded document, the prenuptial agreement, I assumed. This little piece of paper ensures that you'll do exactly as I say, or you'll lose everything. Your family will lose everything. I stared at the document, the fine print swimming before my eyes. It was a cage, meticulously crafted and legally binding. My escape plan was officially, irrevocably dead. You're mine now, Charlotte, he repeated, his voice a silken threat. And I intend to make your life interesting. He turned and walked away, leaving me standing there, alone and utterly trapped. My new home, a sprawling, modern mansion overlooking the city, felt less like a palace and more like a very expensive, very stylish prison. Lucas's kitchen was less a kitchen and more a sterile laboratory designed for the creation of molecular gastronomy, not, food. Stainless steel gleamed under the harsh, recessed lighting. Appliances I couldn't even name hummed with quiet menace. It was the kind of kitchen where you'd expect to find robots preparing nutrient paste, not a human being attempting to cook a meal. I trust you're familiar with preparing Dungeness crab, Charlotte? Lucas's voice, smooth as aged whiskey, cut through the silence. I stared at the countertop where a large plastic container held several very much alive and very much angry crabs. They scuttled sideways, their claws clicking against the plastic, their beady eyes seeming to glare at me with crustacean malice. Familiar, I echoed weakly. My culinary expertise extended to microwaving leftovers and occasionally making toast without setting off the smoke alarm. Of course, crabs, a staple of my diet. This was a blatant lie. The closest I'd ever come to a crab was a crab cake at a wedding once, and I was pretty sure it was mostly imitation crab. Lucas leaned against the counter, his arms crossed. Even blind, he managed to exude an air of smug superiority. Excellent. I prefer them steamed with a light garlic butter sauce, and be careful not to overcook them. They become rubbery. Rubbery. Right, because that was my biggest concern. Not the fact that I was about to engage in mortal combat with a group of armored sea creatures. Athena, Lucas said, addressing the empty air, find me a recipe for steamed Dungeness crab. A disembodied female voice emanating from some hidden speaker responded instantly. Certainly, Mr. Reed, I have located a highly rated recipe from Seafood Sensations website. And so began the most disastrous cooking experience of my life. Athena, the all-knowing smart home assistant, dictated instructions with calm, robotic precision. I, on the other hand, flailed around the kitchen like a drunken octopus. Bring a large pot of water to a rolling boil, Athena instructed. Easy enough. I filled the largest pot I could find with water and wrestled it onto the induction stovetop. So far, so good. Carefully place the live crabs into the boiling water, Athena continued. This was where things went south, rapidly. The crabs, understandably displeased with the prospect of becoming dinner, put up a valiant fight. Claws snapped, legs flailed, and one particularly ambitious crustacean launched itself out of the container and onto the floor, scuttling toward my feet with surprising speed. Get away from me, you eight-legged freak! I shrieked, leaping onto a nearby stool. Lucas, who had been listening to the unfolding chaos with an amused smirk, finally spoke. Having some trouble, Charlotte? Trouble? No. Everything's under control, I lied, desperately trying to regain my composure while simultaneously dodging a rogue crab. The water, now at a rolling boil, began to slosh over the sides of the pot, creating a miniature tidal wave on the pristine countertop. Athena, oblivious to the mayhem, continued to drone on about cooking times and seasoning. Chaos reigned. Crabs escaped. I screamed. Lucas chuckled. At one point, a crab managed to pinch my toe, resulting in a string of expletives that would have made a sailor blush. This was it, I thought grimly, as I battled a particularly feisty crab with a pair of tongs. This was how I died, mauled by crustaceans in a billionaire's kitchen. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the crabs were mostly cooked. They were probably overcooked. They definitely weren't evenly cooked. And the kitchen looked like a war zone. But they were dead, and I was still alive. Small victories. Lucas, after inspecting, or rather smelling and lightly feeling, my disastrous creation, made a non-committal noise. Edible, he declared, which I took as a resounding success considering the circumstances. Underneath the lingering smell of seafood and my simmering resentment, something had shifted. We'd survived the crab apocalypse together. There was a flicker of camaraderie. Maybe not. But it was definitely something. The opulence of Lucas's mansion offered no comfort. Every room felt like a gilded cage, beautifully decorated but utterly confining. I paced the length of my ridiculously large bedroom, the plush carpet muffling the sound of my restless steps. My phone vibrated, displaying Vivian's name. I hesitated, my stomach twisting with a familiar blend of dread and resentment. I answered, putting it on speaker. "Evelyn, darling." Vivian's voice, dripping with false sweetness, filled the room. "How are you settling in?" "I'm fine," I replied, keeping my voice neutral. "And your husband? Is he treating you well?" The word husband felt like a slap in the face. "He's as expected." A brief, tense silence followed. Then Vivian's voice dropped, becoming harder, more calculating. "Your father sends his love. He's stable for now." The unspoken threat hung in the air. Stable for now. As long as I played my part, as long as I kept up the charade, father would remain stable. But the moment I stepped out of line, "I understand," I said, my voice tight with anger. "He misses you, Evelyn. He asks about you constantly. Of course, we can't tell him the truth. It would be too much for him in his condition." The "we" was particularly galling. Vivian was the architect of this entire mess, and she was using my father as a pawn. I managed to arrange a brief, carefully monitored phone call with father. His voice was weak, slurred, but still undeniably him. He sounded confused, disoriented. "Charlotte," he asked, his voice barely a whisper. "Is that you, sweetheart?" My heart ached. "Yes, Papa, it's me." "You sound different," he mumbled. "It's just a bad connection, Papa," I said, forcing a lightness into my voice. "How are you feeling?" Vivian's voice cut in, sharp and intrusive. "Your father needs to rest, Evelyn. We'll talk later." The line went dead. I stared at the phone, my hands shaking. The woman was a viper. A beautifully dressed, perfectly coiffed viper, but a viper nonetheless. She was deliberately keeping father medicated and isolated, using his fragile health to control me and the remaining family assets. Lucas's bathroom was less a bathroom and more a Roman bathhouse reimagined by a minimalist architect. A vast, sunken tub dominated the room, surrounded by gleaming marble and strategically placed mood lighting. It was the kind of bathroom where you expected to find nymphs frolicking, not a blind billionaire demanding assistance. "Charlotte," Lucas called from within, his voice echoing slightly off the tiled walls. "I require your assistance." I hesitated in the doorway, a sense of foreboding settling over me. "Assistance? With what exactly?" "My bath," he replied, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. "I need help regulating the temperature and other things." The other things hung in the air, heavy with unspoken implications. This was a test. Another power play in his ongoing campaign to make my life as uncomfortable as possible. I took a deep breath and entered the bathroom, determined not to show any sign of weakness. The air was thick with steam, scented with something expensive and vaguely masculine. Lucas was already in the tub, the water obscuring most of his body, but not all of it. My cheeks flushed and I averted my eyes, focusing instead on the elaborate control panel on the wall. "Right, the temperature." "Indeed," he said, a hint of amusement in his voice. "And perhaps you could hand me that towel?" The towel was strategically placed on a stool just out of his reach. Of course it was. I navigated the slippery marble floor, acutely aware of his presence in the tub. He was watching me. I could feel it, even though his eyes were unseeing. It was unnerving. I reached for the towel, stretching awkwardly across the edge of the tub. And that's when it happened. My foot slipped on a patch of water, my arms windmilled wildly, and with a shriek of surprise and mortification, I plunged headfirst into the tub, fully clothed. The water was surprisingly warm, but that was small comfort as I sputtered and gasped, my expensive dress instantly soaked through. Lucas, startled by the sudden splash, instinctively reached out, his hands finding my arms. Like, well, this is just perfect, I muttered, spitting out a mouthful of bathwater. Soaking wet, fully dressed, and trapped in a bathtub with a naked, blind billionaire. My life was officially a bad romantic comedy. He started to laugh, a deep, rumbling laugh that shook his chest. It was the first genuine laugh I'd heard from him, and it was surprisingly infectious, and I couldn't help it. I started laughing too. The absurdity of the situation, the sheer ridiculousness of it all, was too much to resist. We laughed, the sound echoing in the cavernous bathroom. It was a moment of shared, unexpected humor, a brief respite from the tension and animosity that had defined our relationship so far. The barriers, for a fleeting moment, were down, and in that moment I saw a glimpse of something else in Lucas Reed. Something vulnerable, something human. It was a glimpse that quickly vanished, replaced by his usual mask of cold control, but I'd seen it and it changed everything. Lucas's study was the epitome of masculine elegance. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves lined the walls, filled with leather-bound volumes that probably cost more than my entire education. A large mahogany desk dominated the room, its surface polished to a mirror sheen. The air smelled of old paper, leather, and a faint hint of cigar smoke. It was a room designed to intimidate, and under normal circumstances it would have. But I wasn't feeling particularly intimidated. I was feeling desperate, and desperate people I discovered were capable of surprising things. "I want to make a deal," I said, my voice surprisingly steady. Lucas, who had been staring out the window, a rather pointless exercise considering, turned towards me, a skeptical expression on his face. "A deal? What kind of deal could you possibly offer me, Charlotte?" "I'm not Charlotte," I said, the words finally escaping my lips. "I may be playing her role, but I'm not her, and I'm not your servant. I'm offering you a partnership." He raised an eyebrow, a flicker of something that might have been amusement in his eyes. "A partnership? Do enlighten me." "You need eyes," I said, cutting to the chase. "Someone to navigate the social and business world. Someone to see the things you can't. Someone to protect you from the sharks that are circling." He remained silent, waiting for me to continue. "I can be that person. I can be your eyes. I'll be your guide, your informant, your shield. I'll tell you who's lying, who's scheming, who's trying to stab you in the back." "And in return?" he asked, his voice smooth and dangerous. "In return, you help me get my father out of that hospital and away from Vivian's control." I laid out my terms, my voice hardening with each word. "You have the resources, the connections, the power. I need your help." He leaned back in his chair, considering my proposition. "You're asking a lot, Evelyn." He used my real name for the first time, and it sent a shiver down my spine. "And I'm offering a lot," I countered. "My loyalty, my intelligence, my unique perspective." He chuckled, a low, rumbling sound. "Unique indeed. You think you can handle the cutthroat world of business, little bird? You think you can play with the wolves?" "I've been dealing with wolves my entire life," I said, my gaze unwavering. "Vivian Hayes is a masterclass in manipulation. I'm more than prepared." He stood up and walked towards me, stopping just inches away. I could feel the heat radiating from his body, smell the faint scent of his expensive cologne. It was intimidating, but I refused to back down. "Let's see if you're as clever as you claim," he said, his voice a low murmur. He reached into a drawer and pulled out a deck of cards. "A simple test." He shuffled the cards with a practiced ease, his fingers moving with surprising dexterity. He then spread them out on the desk, face down. "Tell me," he said, "what cards are where?" I stared at the cards, my mind racing. This wasn't just about memory. It was about observation, about noticing the subtle details that others might miss. And, apparently, he could feel the cards. I took a deep breath and began to study the cards, focusing on the tiny imperfections, the slight variations in texture, the almost imperceptible differences in the way they lay on the desk. Years of having to be the responsible one, of having to anticipate problems and find solutions, had honed my observational skills to a razor's edge. I started to call the cards, slowly at first and then faster. He showed no reaction as I identified card after card, my confidence growing with each correct answer. Finally, there was one card left. I felt a bead of sweat. I focused and softly spoke the card name. He smiled. It was a genuine smile. Very impressive, Evelyn. It seems you're not entirely useless after all. The cocktail party was another exercise in extravagant excess. Another gathering of the rich and ruthless, all vying for power and influence. The air was thick with the scent of expensive perfume, forced laughter, and barely concealed ambition. It was a shark tank, and I was about to dive in head first. Remember, I murmured to Lucas, my voice barely audible above the din of the crowd. Senator Thompson has a wandering eye and a penchant for underage interns. Avoid him. Mrs. Vandergilt is a notorious gossip, but she's also a major investor in several of your competitors' projects. Be charming, but don't reveal anything of substance. And that man over there by the bar with the ridiculously expensive watch? That's Miles Easton. He's Charlotte's friend, and he despises you. Lucas nodded slightly, his expression unreadable. You've done your homework. I'm a quick study, I replied. It's like a game of chess, only with more champagne and less obvious threats. And so began my debut as Lucas Reed's eyes. I guided him through the crowded room, whispering information in his ear, steering him away from potential disasters and toward strategic opportunities. I deflected awkward questions about his blindness with a witty remark or a well-placed compliment. I steered conversations towards topics that would benefit Lucas, subtly highlighting his achievements and downplaying his limitations. I even managed to extract some valuable intel from Mrs. Vandergilt, the notorious gossip, without revealing anything compromising. It was exhilarating. I felt a sense of power, of control that I'd never experienced before. I was playing the game, and I was playing it well. Then Charlotte and Miles Easton arrived. Charlotte, looking radiant in a designer gown that probably cost more than my car, made a beeline for us, a predatory gleam in her eyes. Miles, tall, handsome, and undeniably slimy, followed close behind. Lucas, darling, Charlotte gushed, her voice dripping with false affection. You look well. Charlotte, Lucas replied, his voice cool and detached. Miles. I heard about your engagement, Miles said, his voice laced with barely concealed mockery. To my dear Charlotte, no less. Congratulations. Thank you, Lucas said, his jaw tight. Charlotte, sensing an opportunity to humiliate Lucas, launched into a series of veiled insults, subtly referencing his blindness and implying that he was incapable of running his company. I saw red. Before Lucas could respond, I stepped forward, my voice sharp and cutting. Charlotte, darling, I said, mimicking her earlier tone. You look tired. Perhaps you should get some rest. All that plotting and scheming must be exhausting. Miles stepped forward, and you must be the replacement. I turned to face him. While he might be blind, you are blind to reality. Blind to what is in front of you. Charlotte sputtered, her face turning a delightful shade of crimson. Miles glared at me, his eyes filled with animosity. I wouldn't underestimate my husband, I continued, emphasizing the word with a pointed look at Charlotte. He may not be able to see, but he has other ways of perceiving the world, and he's far more perceptive than you give him credit for. I turned back to Lucas, placing a hand on his arm. It was a gesture of support, of defiance, of something more. A spark of something that was starting to feel a lot like loyalty. Even, dare I say it, affection. The sterile white walls of the hospital room seemed to amplify the beeping of the machines monitoring my father's vital signs. He lay in the bed, his face pale and gaunt, his breathing shallow. Vivian's tender, loving care had taken its toll. I'm here, Papa, I whispered, my voice thick with emotion. It was time. With a plan hatched with Ethan, and, surprisingly, Lucas, though he had grumbled initially, I was going to bust my father out. Ethan had sourced a doctor's coat and surprisingly convincing fake ID. I am so going to fail at this, I muttered to myself, adjusting the oversized coat. It hung off me, making me look more like a child playing dress-up than a medical professional. Think, Evelyn, I told myself. What would a doctor do? I summoned all the confidence I had left. I strode into the hospital, feigning a brisk, professional air. I nodded curtly to the nurses, my heart pounding in my chest. I found Father's room. Luckily, the assigned nurse was taking a well-earned break. I managed to get him into a wheelchair. Where are we going, Charlotte? He mumbled, his eyes fluttering open. It's Evelyn, Papa, I said softly. And we're going home. Getting him out of the hospital was a blur of tense moments and near discoveries. Ethan, waiting outside in a nondescript van, was a godsend. He helped me get Father settled in the back, and we sped away, leaving the sterile prison behind. And back at Lucas's, now our home, in a quiet corner of the study, Ethan confided in me. There's something you should know, Evelyn, he said, his voice low and serious. About Lucas's accident. Accident? I raised an eyebrow. That's what everyone believes, Ethan said. But I've been doing some digging, and I'm almost certain it wasn't an accident. Someone deliberately caused the explosion that blinded him. My blood ran cold. Who? I don't know for sure, Ethan said, but all signs point to someone who wanted him out of the way. Someone who wanted control of Reed Enterprises. The implications were staggering. Lucas wasn't just a blind CEO, he was a target. And by marrying him, I'd inadvertently painted a target on my own back. Later that evening, Miles, in a brazen display of arrogance, stopped by the house. He sauntered in, uninvited, a smug look on his face. Just checking in on the happy couple, he said, his gaze sweeping over me with open disdain. Lucas, seated in his usual chair by the window, remained silent. Get out, I said, my voice dangerously low. Miles chuckled. Feisty. I like that. But you should know, little bird, your husband is finished. He's lost everything. He may be blind, I retorted, stepping towards Miles, my anger boiling over. But you are blind. Blind to decency, blind to loyalty, blind to the fact that you're about to lose everything. He sneered and left. This revelation changed everything. It made Lucas more sympathetic, more vulnerable. And it solidified my resolve to protect him. Not just for my father's sake, but for his own. We were in this together now, whether we liked it or not. The silence in Lucas's bedroom was thick, almost palpable. It was a silence punctuated only by the faint hum of the city outside and the even fainter sound of Lucas's breathing. He'd been unusually quiet since we returned from saving my father, quiet and brooding. I'd found him in his study earlier, staring out the window, again, a rather futile gesture, a glass of amber liquid in his hand. He hadn't said much, just nodded curtly when I'd told him Father was safe and resting comfortably. I'd offered to stay to talk, but he'd dismissed me with a wave of his hand. So I'd retreated to his bedroom, our bedroom, I supposed, although we hadn't exactly shared it in the traditional sense. I'd settled on the ridiculously oversized couch, intending to read. But the events of the day had caught up with me. Exhaustion, both physical and emotional, had pulled me under. I woke to a presence, a warmth near my face, the scent of sandalwood and whiskey. Lucas, he was kneeling beside the couch, his hand hovering just above my cheek. I held my breath, pretending to remain asleep, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs. He gently touched my face, his fingers tracing the line of my jaw, the curve of my cheekbone. His touch was feather-light, tentative, as if he were afraid of waking me. Or perhaps afraid of what he might do if I were awake. Evelyn, he whispered, his voice rough with emotion. It wasn't the cold, detached voice he usually used. It was vulnerable. You're nothing like her. Nothing like I expected. He continued to talk, his words a soft murmur in the darkness. He spoke of his loneliness, of the burden of his family's legacy, of the constant pressure to be strong, to be in control. He spoke of his fear, not of his blindness, but of being alone, of being used, of never being truly seen for who he was. It was a confession, a glimpse into the soul of the man behind the mask, and it was heartbreaking. His fingers brushed against my hair, pushing a stray strand away from my face. He leaned closer, his breath warm on my skin. He began, then hesitated. My eyes fluttered open, though I tried to feign continued sleep. It was too late. He was close. So close I could see the faint stubble on his jaw, the dark lashes that framed his unseeing eyes. He was going to kiss me. I knew it. And God help me, I wanted him to. His lips brushed against mine, a feather-light touch, a question more than a kiss. It was tentative, hesitant, almost innocent. The spell was broken by the jarring ring of my cell phone. Lucas jerked back, his eyes widening, a flicker of something and crossing his face. Was it embarrassment? Regret? I couldn't tell. I sat up, my heart still racing, my cheeks burning. I should get that, I stammered, fumbling for the phone. He stood up abruptly, his composure returning, the mask firmly back in place. Of course. The moment was gone, shattered, and we were both left, shaken and confused, adrift in the wreckage of what might have been. The attraction was undeniable, a roaring fire that threatened to consume us both. But the circumstances, the lies, the deception, the forced marriage, it was all a tangled mess, a web of complications that seemed impossible to unravel. The gallery was a swirling vortex of air kisses, designer dresses, and predatory smiles. The launch of Charlotte's My New Jewelry collection was in full swing, and the room was packed with the creme de la creme of society, all eager to be seen and to judge. I stood beside Lucas, my hand resting lightly on his arm, guiding him through the throng. He, in turn, was remarkably adept at navigating the crowded space, his other senses compensating for his lack of sight. "Mr. Whitmore is approaching," I murmured, my voice barely audible above the din. 12 o'clock. He's wearing a navy suit, a rather unfortunate floral tie, and an expression that suggests he's just swallowed a lemon. Mr. Whitmore was a key investor, a man with deep pockets and a reputation for being notoriously difficult to please. Securing his support for the jewelry line was crucial. Lucas nodded subtly, his expression unchanged. "Lead the way." We approached Mr. Whitmore, and I launched into my carefully rehearsed introduction, highlighting the unique and innovative qualities of Charlotte's My designs. Then she arrived. Charlotte, resplendent in a scarlet dress that screamed, "Look at me," swept into the room, Miles Easton trailing behind her like a particularly oily shadow. "Evelyn, darling!" Charlotte exclaimed, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "And Lucas, how wonderful to see you both." Her gaze lingered on the display cases, where her jewelry glittered under the spotlights. My jewelry. The designs I'd poured my heart and soul into, the designs that were my ticket to freedom, my escape from the suffocating grip of my family's legacy. That conniving little... I muttered under my breath, my fist clenching. "I swear, if I get my hands on her, I'll..." Lucas placed a calming hand on my arm. "Patience, Evelyn," he murmured. "Let her play her game." Charlotte, oblivious to my simmering rage, launched into a gushing monologue about her inspiration, her creative process, and her passion for design. It was a performance worthy of an Oscar, if the Oscar were awarded for blatant plagiarism. Mr. Whitmore, however, seemed unimpressed. He examined the jewelry with a critical eye, his expression growing increasingly sour. "These designs," he said, his voice laced with skepticism, "they're familiar." Charlotte faltered, her carefully constructed facade cracking. "Familiar. I assure you, Mr. Whitmore, these are entirely original creations." It was Lucas who delivered the final blow. "They're not," he said, his voice calm but firm. "They're Evelyn's." The room fell silent. All eyes turned to Lucas, then to me, then to Charlotte, whose face was now a mask of horror. "Evelyn has been designing jewelry since she was a child," Lucas continued, his voice amplified by the sudden quiet. "I've seen her sketches. I've felt the textures of her materials. I know her work when I encounter it." He reached out and, with unerring accuracy, picked up a delicate silver necklace, one of my signature pieces. He ran his fingers over the intricate design, his touch surprisingly gentle. "This," he said, holding up the necklace, "is Evelyn's, and it's exquisite." Charlotte's carefully constructed world crumbled around her. Mr. Whitmore, his face a thundercloud, turned and stalked away. Miles, ever the opportunist, quietly slipped out of the room. The act was one of pure loyalty, and it was also an act that changed things between us once again. The penthouse was shrouded in a heavy silence. the aftermath of the disastrous launch hanging in the air like a toxic cloud. Lucas had retreated to his study, a bottle of his finest whiskey, his only companion. I found him there, slumped in his chair, the glass half empty in his hand. He was drunk, not falling down drunk, but drunk enough to loosen his tongue and lower his inhibitions. "Lucas," I said softly, approaching him cautiously, "maybe you should—" "Go away, Charlotte," he slurred, his voice thick with bitterness. "Just, go away." My heart sank. He still thought I was Charlotte. Even after everything, even after he'd defended me, exposed her lies, he still saw me as her. "It's Evelyn," I said, my voice trembling slightly. He looked up, his eyes unfocused, struggling to make me out. "Evelyn?" He reached out, his hand brushing against my cheek. It was a repeat of the night before, only this time, there was no tenderness, no hesitation. This time, it was fueled by alcohol and despair. He pulled me towards him, his grip surprisingly strong. I stumbled, falling onto his lap. His arms wrapped around me, holding me tight. "Charlotte," he murmured, his breath hot against my ear. "Well, why? Why do you do this?" I froze, my body tense with a mixture of shock and confusion. He thought I was Charlotte. He was drunk, heartbroken, and utterly confused. "Lucas, it's me. Evelyn," I said, trying to push him away. But he didn't seem to hear me. He buried his face in my hair, his grip tightening. I thought you were different." The pain in his voice was raw, palpable, and it was directed at the wrong person. I was torn. Part of me wanted to comfort him, to ease his pain. Another part of me was furious at being mistaken for my sister, at being the recipient of his misplaced affection. And a small, treacherous part of me wanted to stay right where I was. "Lucas, stop," I said, my voice firmer this time. "You're drunk. You don't know what you're doing." He lifted his head, his eyes searching my face. For a moment, I thought he saw me, truly saw me. But then, his gaze clouded over again, and he pulled me closer, his lips seeking mine. I pushed him away hard. He stumbled back, his expression a mixture of confusion and hurt. "I'm not Charlotte," I said, my voice shaking with anger and a strange, unsettling sadness. "I'm not her." I turned and fled the room, leaving him alone with his whiskey and his demons. The scene ended, not with a bang, but with a whimper, a quiet, devastating collapse of everything we'd been building. The rift between us was wider than ever, a chasm of misunderstanding and misplaced blame, and I had no idea how to bridge it. The morning light filtering through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the penthouse did little to dispel the gloom that had settled over me. My head throbbed, a dull counterpoint to the sharp ache in my chest. The memory of the previous night, Lucas's drunken embrace, his mistaken identity, my own conflicted emotions, replayed in my mind, each replay twisting the knife a little deeper. I found Lucas in the living room, staring out at the cityscape, a glass of water and a bottle of aspirin on the table beside him. He looked rough. His hair was disheveled, his eyes bloodshot, and his jaw shadowed with stubble. The picture of a hungover billionaire. He turned as I approached, his expression guarded. "Evelyn." "Lucas," I replied, my voice carefully neutral. An awkward silence stretched between us. He clearly remembered something about the night before, but the details were probably hazy. He took a deep breath as if preparing to apologize. "About last night?" Before he could finish, his phone rang, shattering the fragile truce. He answered it, his expression hardening with each passing second. "What?" he barked into the phone. "When? How?" He listened for a moment longer, his face turning ashen. Then he slammed the phone down, his hand trembling. "Whitmore," he said, his voice tight with barely controlled rage. "He's pulled out of the deal, the contract. It's been transferred to Easton." My stomach dropped. Miles, it had to be Miles and Charlotte. They were striking back and they were hitting Lucas where it hurt most. I'm sure there's an explanation," I began, trying to sound reasonable, even though my own suspicions were rising. Lucas turned on me, his eyes blazing with fury. "An explanation? What possible explanation could there be other than you?" I recoiled, stunned by the accusation. "Me? What are you talking about?" "Don't play innocent with me," he snarled. You were with him, weren't you? You were working with them all along. Charlotte and Miles, you played me for a fool. That's not true, I protested, my voice rising in indignation. I would never. I should have known, he interrupted, his voice dripping with bitterness. You're all the same, greedy, manipulative, and utterly without scruples, just like your sister. The words hit me like a physical blow. All the progress we'd made, all the trust we'd apparently built, gone, shattered in an instant. He saw me as Charlotte, as a scheming, gold-digging liar. I've been working to help you, I said, my voice trembling with a mixture of anger and hurt. I saved your face at the engagement. I helped you with Whitmore. I even got my father out of that hospital, risking everything. And you expect me to believe that was all out of the goodness of your heart? He scoffed. You were playing the long game, waiting for the right moment to strike. He was too blinded by his anger, by his preconceived notions to see the truth. There was no point in arguing. Believe what you want, I said, my voice cold with resignation. I'm done. I turned and walked away, leaving him standing there, alone in his fury. My heart felt like a shattered piece of glass, each shard cutting deeper with every step. Lucas sat in his office, the silence deafening. The remnants of his outburst still hung in the air, a toxic cloud of accusation and regret. He'd messed up, badly. Ethan, he said, his voice rough, I need you to pull up the security footage from last night, the penthouse, all of it. Ethan, ever the calm and efficient presence, nodded. Right away, Mr. Reed. Within minutes, the footage was playing on the large screen in Lucas's office. He watched, his stomach churning with a growing sense of dread, as the events of the previous night unfolded. He saw himself, drunk and disoriented, stumbling around the living room. He saw Evelyn trying to help him, her expression a mixture of concern and exasperation. Then he saw the crucial moment, the embrace, the mistaken identity. Evelyn's clear rejection, her repeated insistence that she wasn't Charlotte. He also saw with sickening clarity the footage from the gallery. Evelyn, defending him against Miles's snide remarks, her voice ringing with genuine anger and loyalty. He saw Miles later slipping away, a look of calculating malice on his face. And he saw Charlotte in a discreet corner of the room, speaking urgently into her phone, her expression a mask of triumph. It was all there, in black and white, undeniable proof of Evelyn's innocence and of his own colossal stupidity. Damn it, Ethan, he said, his voice filled with self-loathing. I've ruined everything. Ethan said nothing, simply placed a hand on Lucas's shoulder in a gesture of silent support. He didn't need to say anything. The footage spoke for itself. Lucas had accused the one person who had been consistently loyal to him, the one person who had stood by him even when he'd been at his worst. He'd pushed her away, driven her away with his baseless accusations and his blind rage. He had to fix this. He had to find her, apologize, beg for her forgiveness. But he had a sinking feeling that it might already be too late. Charlotte's apartment was a stark contrast to the opulent penthouse she'd briefly inhabited. It was smaller, less luxurious, but still stylish, reflecting her expensive but ultimately shallow taste. It's done, Miles said, entering the room with a smug grin. Whitmore's deal is ours. Reed is finished. Charlotte, pacing restlessly, didn't share his enthusiasm. It's not enough, she said, her voice tight with frustration. As long as Evelyn is around, she's a threat. She knows too much. So, what do you propose we do? Miles asked, raising an eyebrow. Send her a strongly worded letter? Charlotte stopped pacing and turned to face him, her eyes narrowed. She's a loose end, Miles. We need to tie her up, permanently. Miles's smile widened. Now you're talking. I have some associates who can handle that sort of thing. They began to plot, their voices low and conspiratorial. Their plan was simple, brutal, and utterly ruthless. Kidnap Evelyn, silence her, and make sure she could never interfere with their plans again. Meanwhile, Evelyn, oblivious to the danger she was in, was trying to pick up the pieces of her shattered life. She'd retreated to her old apartment, a small, cramped space that felt like a sanctuary compared to the gilded cage of Lucas's penthouse. Her phone rang. It was her father, his voice weak but filled with concern. Evelyn, darling, are you all right? He asked. Vivian told me. About the engagement. About Lucas. Evelyn forced a lightness into her voice that she didn't feel. I'm fine, Papa. Just taking a little break. Be careful, sweetheart, he said. Vivian, she's not to be trusted. And that man, that Lucas Reed, I don't like him. I know, Papa, she said softly. I know. She hung up the phone, her heart heavy with worry. She was alone, vulnerable, and facing an uncertain future. But she wasn't defeated. She would find a way to clear her name, to expose Charlotte's lies, and to protect her father. She just didn't know how. And she didn't know that time was running out. My phone buzzed, the shrill ring cutting through the quiet of my small apartment. The caller ID displayed St. Jude's Hospital. My heart leaped into my throat. Father. Hello? I answered, my voice trembling. Ms. Hayes? A frantic voice said. It's Nurse Peterson, your father. He's taken a turn for the worse. You need to come quickly. Panic clawed at my throat. I'm on my way. I didn't think. I didn't hesitate. I grabbed my keys and bolted out the door, my mind racing with a terrifying mixture of fear and dread. The hospital was a blur of activity. I rushed to the front desk, my breath coming in ragged gasps. My father, Robert Hayes. Where is he? The receptionist, a bored-looking woman with a name tag that read Brenda, typed slowly on her computer. Room 304, but I didn't wait to hear the rest. I sprinted towards the elevators, my heart pounding in my chest. Room 304 was empty. The bed was neatly made, the machine silent. Confusion warred with the lingering panic. Where is he? Where's my father? A hand clamped down on my shoulder. I whirled around, coming face to face with Charlotte. Looking for someone, sister? She sneered, her eyes glittering with malicious triumph. Two burly men, thugs straight out of Central Casting, flanked her. Miles's goons, no doubt. This was a trap, and I'd walked right into it. Charlotte, what have you done? I demanded, trying to keep my voice steady, despite the fear that was coiling in my stomach. Oh, don't worry about dear old daddy, Charlotte said, her voice dripping with sarcasm. He's fine for now, but you, Evelyn, you're the problem. They started to close in. I backed away, my mind racing, searching for an escape route. There was none. Get her, Charlotte ordered. The goons lunged. I dodged, narrowly avoiding their grasp, and sprinted down the hallway, my heels clicking on the linoleum floor. They were faster than me, stronger. I wouldn't be able to outrun them for long. I burst through a side exit, finding myself in a deserted parking lot. The cold night air hit my face, a stark contrast to the sterile warmth of the hospital. The goons were right behind me. I could hear their heavy breathing, their muttered curses. Suddenly, a car screeched to a halt beside me, the passenger door flying open. Get in! Ethan's voice, urgent and commanding. I didn't hesitate. I dove into the car, slamming the door shut just as one of the goons reached for me. Ethan peeled out, tires squealing, leaving the thugs and Charlotte staring after us in frustrated rage. What the hell was that? I gasped, my heart still pounding. Charlotte, Ethan said grimly, she's not playing games anymore. He drove us back to Lucas' penthouse, but upon approaching, something was clearly wrong. Stay here, he said. He got out to assess. He came back quickly. The power's out. Security systems are down. It's a trap. They are inside. Before I could even comprehend, everything went black. Then a flickering dim light. Lucas, he could see, not perfectly, but enough. I opened my mouth to question, but he shushed me, bringing a finger to my lips. In the near darkness of the penthouse, surrounded by unknown dangers, the tension was a living thing. It crackled in the air, thick and suffocating, and then, as if drawn together by an invisible force, we kissed. It was a kiss born of fear, of relief, of a desperate need for connection. It was a culmination of all the unspoken feelings, all the suppressed desires, all the barriers that had kept us apart. In the darkness, I thought, my mind reeling, all the pretenses fell away. There was only him and me, and the undeniable truth of what we felt. The kiss deepened, becoming more urgent, more passionate. It was a kiss that said everything we couldn't say, a kiss that promised everything we might never have. The Reed Enterprises boardroom was a battlefield. The long, polished table reflected the grim faces of the assembled board members. Lucas, still feigning complete blindness, sat at the head of the table, Ethan at his side. As you all know, Damian Reed said, his voice dripping with false sincerity. My father, Robert Reed, has stepped down as CEO, and in his wisdom, he has appointed me to take his place. A murmur of assent rippled through the room. Damien, with his slicked back hair and expensive suit, looked every bit the part of a corporate leader. But Lucas knew the truth. He was a snake, a viper, waiting to strike. Suddenly, the doors to the boardroom burst open and Miles Easton strode in, a smug grin on his face. He held up a document. I believe this changes things, Miles said, his voice amplified by a video conference system. He was joining remotely, a coward's tactic. This document, signed by Robert Reed himself, transfers the controlling interest of Reed Enterprises to me. The board members gasped. Chaos erupted. Lucas, maintaining his composure, spoke calmly. That document is a forgery. Is it? Miles challenged. I have a handwriting expert who will testify otherwise, and I might add a certain seal that authenticates it. The company seal. The one that had gone missing from Lucas's office. The one that Evelyn had warned him about. Damien jumped in. I have seen the documents. We must take a vote. A tense boardroom battle ensued. Lucas, using his wits and the information Evelyn had gleaned over the past weeks, countered Miles's claims, pointing out inconsistencies in his story, questioning the validity of the document, appealing to the board members' sense of loyalty and reason. But it was an uphill battle. Miles had the element of surprise and the forged document on his side. The vote was called. It was close, but not enough. Lucas and Evelyn were finished. They were evicted that day, security escorting them out. They found temporary refuge in Ethan's old apartment, a small, cramped space that was a far cry from the opulent penthouse. Sitting on the edge of the worn-out bed, Lucas finally confessed his feelings. Evelyn, he said, his voice raw with emotion. I love you. I've been a fool, a blind fool in more ways than one. I should have trusted you. I should have believed you. He didn't mention his recovered sight. Not yet. He was afraid of her reaction, afraid of losing her again. Ethan, ever the investigator, had been busy. He returned to the apartment, his face grim. I've found something, he said, holding up a file. Concrete evidence linking Miles to the attack that blinded you, Lucas. It was him. He paid someone to sabotage the equipment. This revelation, while shocking, was not entirely unexpected. It confirmed what Lucas had long suspected, that Miles was capable of anything. Later, Miles paid Lucas a visit to his office. He was there to gloat. You were always weak, Miles spat. He launched at Lucas, and they fought. Miles, younger and stronger and with the element of surprise, was winning. He landed blow after blow. Lucas was struggling. The final blow connected, sending Lucas crashing to the floor unconscious. Lucas awoke to the blurry image of Evelyn's face, her eyes filled with concern. He was lying on a lumpy couch in Ethan's apartment, his head throbbing, his body aching. But he could see, not perfectly, not yet. But the world was no longer a blur of darkness. He could see the details of Evelyn's face, the worry lines etched around her eyes, the stray strands of hair that had escaped her messy bun. He could see the small, cramped apartment, the worn furniture, the chipped paint on the walls, and he could see her, and the sight was overwhelming. Lucas, are you all right? Evelyn asked, her voice laced with anxiety. He wanted to tell her. He wanted to shout it from the rooftops. I can see you. But he hesitated. Fear, a cold, paralyzing fear, gripped him. What if she felt betrayed? What if she thought he'd been lying to her all along? What if his recovered sight changed everything between them? I'm fine, he mumbled, his voice rough. Just a headache. He kept his secret, clinging to it like a lifeline. He would use it to his advantage, to protect her, to take down Miles and Charlotte. But for now, he would keep it to himself. Charlotte paced the floor of the run-down warehouse, her nerves frayed. This was her last chance, her final gamble. Everything was riding on this. Are you sure this will work? She asked, her voice sharp with anxiety. The man, a burly, scarred individual with a menacing grin, nodded. Trust me, lady. We're professionals. He and the goons from before had done their job. They had taken Evelyn. Evelyn was tied to a chair, gagged. Her defiant eyes were the only part not showing fear. Charlotte's plan was audacious, bordering on insane. She intended to replace Evelyn permanently. She'd found a plastic surgeon, a disgraced doctor with a flexible moral compass who was willing to alter her appearance to make her look even more like Evelyn. And then she would step into Evelyn's life, marry Lucas, who she still believed was blind, and secure her future. As for the real Evelyn, she would simply disappear. Charlotte smirked and picked up her phone. She called Lucas, altering her voice slightly, mimicking Evelyn's tone. "Lucas, it's me. I need to see you." She gave him an address, a location far from the warehouse, a place where she could control the narrative. It was time to set her plan in motion. The final act of this twisted drama was about to begin. Ethan's cramped apartment felt even smaller with the weight of unspoken tension hanging in the air. Lucas, his back to the room, stared out the window, his posture rigid. He could see the city lights, the blurred reflections in the glass, the subtle movements of the traffic below. He could see it all, but he couldn't let on. Not yet. "She called," he said, his voice carefully neutral. "She wants to meet." Ethan, who had been cleaning his rather impressive collection of concealed weaponry, apparently being a billionaire's assistant required more than just scheduling meetings, looked up sharply. "Charlotte?" "She said it was Evelyn," Lucas corrected, a subtle emphasis on the said. But, he turned, facing Ethan. The fear in his eyes was masked by a carefully cultivated facade of calm. He couldn't risk revealing his recovered sight, not until he knew exactly what Charlotte was planning. "I need you to track her phone," Lucas said, "and be ready to move. Something's not right." Ethan nodded, already tapping away on his phone. "Got it. I'll put a trace on her signal." The scene shifted to the warehouse, a cold, damp space filled with the shadows of forgotten machinery. Evelyn, bound and gagged, struggled against her restraints. The ropes bit into her wrists, the rough fabric of the gag chafing her skin. But her mind was racing, searching for a way out. She'd been studying her captors, observing their routines, their weaknesses. The two goons were large and intimidating, but they weren't particularly bright, and one of them, the one with the perpetually runny nose, had a habit of nervously scratching his arm. A rash, an allergy. She remembered a passing mention. Back at Ethan's apartment, Lucas received the call. Evelyn's voice. "Lucas, darling," Charlotte said, her voice a poor imitation of Evelyn's. "I need to see you. It's urgent." "Where are you?" Lucas asked, his voice carefully neutral. She gave him an address, a deserted park on the outskirts of the city. A place where she could control the situation. A place where there would be no witnesses. "I'll be there," Lucas said, his voice betraying none of the turmoil he felt. He hung up the phone, his jaw clenched. He could see the difference now. He could see the subtle nuances of Charlotte's face in his memory, the hardness in her eyes, the shallowness of her smile. He could see how different she was from Evelyn, from her genuine warmth, her fierce intelligence, her quiet strength. He was playing a dangerous game, pretending to be blind while navigating a world that was suddenly, vividly, in focus. But he had to play it. For Evelyn. The two storylines, Lucas's careful deception and Evelyn's desperate struggle, began to converge, the tension ratcheting up with each passing moment. The warehouse was cold, the air thick with the smell of dust and decay. Evelyn continued to struggle, testing the strength of the ropes, searching for any weakness. The goon with the rash, Lefty, she had decided to call him, was on watch. She had to act fast. With a surge of adrenaline, she slammed her chair against a nearby metal shelf, the loud clang echoing through the warehouse. "What the?" Lefty exclaimed, turning towards the noise. Evelyn continued to create a diversion. She needed to do something, anything. She focused and made contact with Lefty's arm, pushing against it, rubbing. "Hey, what the?" he began. It started small, but then the rash flared. He was allergic to metal. He started to itch uncontrollably. His breathing became wheezy. "I can't breathe," he gasped, clutching at his throat. The other goon, startled by his companion's sudden distress, rushed to his side. This was her chance. Evelyn, using all her remaining strength, strained against the ropes. They were tight, but they were old, frayed. She felt a strand snap, then another. With a final desperate effort, she broke free. She scrambled to her feet, ignoring the throbbing pain in her wrists. She had to get out. She had to expose Charlotte. She had to reclaim her life. She ran. Meanwhile, Lucas had secured a car from Ethan. It was time. Evelyn had managed to get to a phone. And now she was headed to the one place where she knew she could expose Charlotte's lies and reclaim her stolen work, the International Jewelry Design Competition. She arrived at the venue, her heart pounding, her clothes torn and dirty. She slipped in unnoticed, blending into the crowd of elegantly dressed guests. She had registered for the competition months ago under her alias, Cecilia. It was time for Cecilia to make her grand entrance. The grand ballroom of the hotel glittered under the chandeliers. The air buzzed with anticipation. The final awards of the International Jewelry Design Competition were about to be announced. Charlotte, wearing one of Evelyn's dresses and a smug smile, stood near the stage, basking in the glow of stolen admiration. Miles, ever the loyal accomplice, hovered nearby. The presenter, a renowned figure in the jewelry world, stepped up to the microphone. And now, for the grand prize, the award for Best in Show. He paused for dramatic effect. The winner is Cecilia. A gasp rippled through the crowd. Charlotte's smile faltered. Evelyn stepped forward, her head held high. The spotlight found her, illuminating her dirt-stained clothes and bruised wrists, but also highlighting the fierce determination in her eyes. "That's me," she said, her voice clear and strong. "Cecilia, or, as some of you may know me, Evelyn Hayes." The murmurs intensified. Charlotte's face turned ashen. "The designs you see here tonight," Evelyn continued, her voice ringing through the ballroom, "are mine, stolen from me by my own sister, Charlotte Hayes." She laid out the entire story, her voice trembling with emotion but unwavering in its conviction. She spoke of the stolen sketches, the forged documents, the desperate attempts to silence her. The audience was captivated, stunned into silence. Charlotte, her carefully constructed facade crumbling, tried to interrupt, to deny, but her words were drowned out by the rising tide of outrage. Suddenly, Lucas stepped forward, his presence commanding attention. He stood beside Evelyn, his hand resting on her arm, a silent show of support. "I can confirm everything Evelyn has said," he said, his voice firm and resolute. "I was a witness to Charlotte's deception, and I have evidence to prove it." He signaled to Ethan, who had discreetly entered the ballroom with several police officers. They moved towards Charlotte and Miles, their expressions grim. "Charlotte Hayes, Miles Easton, you're under arrest," one of the officers said. Charlotte, her eyes wide with panic, tried to flee, but it was too late. The police apprehended her, her carefully constructed world collapsing around her. Miles, seeing that he was cornered, surrendered without a fight. Lucas turned to Evelyn, his gaze filled with love and admiration. He could see her now, truly see her, and the sight took his breath away. "I knew," he said, his voice soft but clear. "I knew it was you all along, and I can see, I've been able to see for days." He took her hand, his fingers interlacing with hers. "I love you, Evelyn Hayes, not Charlotte, you." The confession was both a declaration of love and a strategic move, ensuring Charlotte's complete and utter downfall. The audience, captivated by the unfolding drama, erupted in applause. Evelyn stared at him, her heart overflowing with a mixture of shock, joy, and overwhelming love. She'd won. She'd reclaimed her life, her designs, her future. And she'd found love in the most unexpected of places. The police led Charlotte and Miles away, their reign of terror finally over. The applause continued, a symphony of vindication and relief. And in the midst of it all, Lucas and Evelyn stood together, their hands clasped, their eyes locked, their future stretching before them, bright and full of promise,